install the technology. Great. So now everyone can see my screen. So essentially, Fruition Partners, if you've joined us before for one of these webinars, or you've been a partner with us in the past, or we've worked together, you know we're a team of cloud experts, more than 100 people strong. We've done more than 200 implementations of ServiceNow, and we've got 10 years plus experience delivering IT service management solutions to our customers. One thing I will say about this particular webinar is it's pulled from a ServiceNow Service Catalog deployment training class. However, the content we're going to cover today really is independent of that particular solution. So the things we'll talk about will be applicable to other solutions as well. Fruition really provides end-to-end services. We try to address all of the needs related to IT service management, anything from training, consulting, implementations, integrations, custom development, and also managed services. That's probably enough by way of introduction, so let's jump right into the material. In this session, I really want to talk about the request fulfillment process. What does ITIL tell us we're supposed to be doing activity-wise as far as the request fulfillment process is concerned? I want to stress something that I think is probably an underutilized aspect of ITIL, of the ITIL framework, is the use of request models to help deploy service catalog capabilities more quickly, help you reduce the total cost of ownership of maintaining unique requestable items in the form of a requestable catalog, and really a way to create a consistent working environment so that both those people requesting and people fulfilling can understand what work is really in front of them at any given moment. We're going to talk a little bit about the implementation process, some recommendations around the implementation process, priority setting priorities, gathering requirements, and then I do want to spend a few minutes and talk about the challenges of new employee onboarding. I probably do have more content here than we could cover in an hour, but I promise that we will get to the new employee onboarding discussion, because I'm sure that's probably one of the motivators that's bringing a number of people to this particular call. The request fulfillment process in the eyes of the ITIL framework really is intended to provide you a mechanism for end users, customers of IT, and even members of IT, the ability to request things from IT through the service desk. The request fulfillment process addresses 4 specific areas or types of requests listed there at the top. The request for information, request for advice, like on-the-spot training, media training, like I need to do a Microsoft mail merge, requesting access to be granted, access to a specific service. And maybe this might be your roles management, like you're managing the security roles for your financial services platform. And then the last one here on the list, the standard change. The idea of a standard change really is anything that's under the control of change management. We would consider a standard change being something as simple as replacing someone's laptop. Requesting a new laptop is quite often a common form of request that people might use. I really consider that to be a standard change, being a configuration item that's changed in the production environment. The objectives of the process, really providing a channel for people to submit those requests, record, monitor, and track all the activities that need to be completed in order for those requests to be fulfilled, and then also making sure that the process is as efficient as possible. This efficiency, I think, actually does come back to that use of request models. One of the things to consider is that service requests typically get channeled through a service desk. So do incidents. In a lot of cases, I work with organizations, or I'll come across organizations in our ITIL Foundations training classes, or in even ServiceNow system administration classes, where people will have this idea of needing to track incident tasks. Incident tasks as an ITIL concept don't really exist. When I hear someone's asking for an ability to have an incident record that has multiple tasks below it, when I dig a little deeper into the process that they're actually trying to address, 9 times out of 10, they're really talking about the service request fulfillment process. The tasks of having one person go fulfill one particular effort while another person goes and fulfills another one. So I really want to separate the idea that a lot of organizations that have evolved through other platforms or past platforms have been dependent on using the incident management application and collapsing these two processes together. Incident and request really need to be their own separate processes, and I want to stress that. So whenever I see my statement at the bottom here, or whenever I hear the words incident tasks, I know what they're really in need of is request fulfillment. Some of the critical success factors of good service request fulfillment that we'd like to see. Agreement with the business on what will be standardized. What are the requests that we will use request fulfillment to deliver? Okay. Let's make a determination. What are repeatable? What are relatively low risk? What can we manage through an automated process? We also need to understand who's entitled to request things. Not everything is requestable by everybody. We need to understand the conditions of why one individual is able to request something versus someone else. Perhaps it's by role. It might be by their physical location. It could be by the department that they're a member of. Service catalogs need to be easily accessible, easily understood. Jumping down to my last bullet there, needs to be easy to use, very simple, straightforward. People should be able to anticipate what's actually going to be happening as a result. We do find that standardized fulfillment procedures will significantly ease the deployment, the development and deployment of a catalog solution, of a service catalog solution. And then also lastly, we want to be a single point of contact for all request capabilities through a single interface. The request fulfillment process from ITIL provides us a 5-activity breakdown here. You're going to submit the request, the actual formulation of the request. You're going to then go ask for someone to pay for it. There's not a need to necessarily fulfill a request if someone's not willing to spend the budget. Then we're going to have an additional layer of approvals. I'll get into some details about the additional layers of approvals in a minute. Lastly, we would complete any fulfillment tasks, and then we would close the actual service request. When you're submitting a request, the employee needs to be able to access a display or a list of things that they're eligible for. We want entitlements to help us control that list. In that list of things that we're going to present to them, we're going to see a number of different types of things. I really consider things falling into 4 different categories. Tangible and intangible items are those things that either physically, like a laptop, it gets delivered, or something that gets delivered virtually, like an email address or a new user account. People also have the need to go to a service catalog to request processes to be executed. Things like the new hire process, or a relocation. A termination is another example if you're going to let someone go. Those processes, those process-based requests, are really an aggregation of multiple tangible or intangible items. One of the points I'm going to make several times throughout this presentation is the work that you have to do to deploy a service catalog solution is in the items. You want to focus on the items. That then enables you to do these process-based requests. Once the user has submitted that request, maybe in that request they've had a few variables that they had to answer, some questions they had to answer, provide some additional information, it's time to go in for a financial approval. Financial approvals should be fairly uniform across your organization. Determining your financial approval scheme based on what level the employee who is requesting, they may have certain purchasing authorization. You also might have based on a certain amount of money being spent. We need to escalate this up the flagpole a little bit. We might need to go up a few tiers to get the proper level of approval to spend certain dollar amounts. We can look at a combination of both a graduated schedule based on roles or job titles and a multi-tiered approach so that We ensure that we're not asking a VP to approve something until after we've already asked the department head to approve it. Okay. These policies should apply to all requests. The financial approvals collection should be fairly straightforward and visible and equally governed so that it's applied applicably across all requests, evenly across all requests. Some things we might request don't have any cost at all. That might give us an opportunity to completely skip this particular level of approval. Once financial approvals have been achieved, though, if someone's willing to spend the money, we might have the need for additional approvals. Additional approvals can come in multiple forms. I might have security concerns around a particular individual being granted the ability to create purchase orders. I might have architectural concerns about certain pieces of technology being introduced into the environment. I might want to be able to control both of those. Okay? Additional approvals then might be executed based on each individual item in a request. You might have some compliance issues we also need to pay attention to. Fulfillment tasks make up the repeatable work that needs to take place. Each time a particular laptop gets requested, a series of activities could be fairly consistent. We're going to procure all of our laptops the same way. We might use imaging software to image and configure all of our laptops the same way. Right? Fulfillment tasks, where possible, should be standardized and maintain consistency, making it easier for people to identify how much work they actually have on their plate that day. If I'm the configuration person at a service desk or in a desktop support group, I'd like to be able to go to a single place, be able to filter my list of task assignments and see how many laptops I have to configure, how many desktops. It's easier for me to configure 5 laptops at the same time than to do them one at a time. I can save a little bit of time, a little bit of effort. Once everything that's under a single request has been completed and fulfilled, the request itself gets closed. The user then potentially, you might follow up with that user and ask for some customer satisfaction survey or at least some sort of review with the customer that they've received what they have expected, that the result was what they anticipated. Now let's talk about request models a little bit. If we look at that process, that 5-stage activity breakdown, and we look for an opportunity to create a request model for each of the major different classes of requests that we look at and use those request models repeatedly, we can speed up our ability to deliver multiple service requests for the use by the business, and we can create some consistency on our fulfillment procedures on the back end. We also have the opportunity to greatly reduce the total cost of ownership of maintaining a requestable service catalog, because we'll know basically, or we'll know consistency is threaded through the individual items that we see in the catalog. The fulfillment procedures will be consistent. So when I say request model, I'm really describing the predefined steps that it takes to complete a request of a particular type. The things that we might consider when we're building, when we're looking at our solution, is the questions that we ask the end user might be fairly consistent. The approvals required. The approvals for financial requests, the financial aspect of approvals, really should be consistent across all requests. But you might also have some consistency for the security approvals across particular types of requests. The fulfillment tasks should be consistent where possible. Procurement should be able to go to a single list of activities and understand what all the procurement tasks are, because they'll be formatted uniformly. And strictly, all they'll need to do is group them by the things that they need to procure. You might also have configuration tasks created the same way. Your reusable notifications and escalation points. Reusable service and operational level agreements. And also, you look for reusable business rules that can apply to a single set of requestable items. Models are these mechanisms that will allow us to repeat things. if we define these request models around starting with maybe 4 basic areas. The 4 areas that I would recommend would be the tangible, the intangible, the service change, or the standard change, and then also potentially process-based. The process-based request model is the most difficult one to get your head around. It's because it's the most complex. That's why I highly recommend we start at the top of this list and we work our way down. Tangible items that are deployed are anything really physical, anything that you pick up. Someone typically has to buy it. You might have some tangible items that require configuration, some might not. But usually all tangible items have to be procured. They have to be, quite often they have to be configured. They need to be delivered in some mechanism, some method, and they potentially also need to be installed. Some groups outside of IT might be brought into these request fulfillment activities, these tasks that need to take place, like, for example, a shipping department. You might have laptops getting boxed up and shipped out. Maybe you've got a mobile sales force and you're doing a laptop refresh program where you're updating laptops for your mobile sales folks. The tasks that you'll be generating and assigning will be going to people outside of IT. The list down below is just a standard list that you might brainstorm. You might come up with, I think just about every organization out there probably has this list, and then you might have another half a dozen things that you might be considering also as the tangible items that you manage. One thing to consider about tangible items is that typically there are more fulfillment tasks to delivering a tangible item, but fewer approvals compared to an intangible item. I'm going to jump back and forth on my slides here for a second. But on an intangible item, you're really looking at something that's more like a user account or an email address, virtual server deployments. These are things where you're not physically delivering something to someone. You're providing them access to something, or you're providing them a user account that basically has fewer fulfillment tasks, because all I need to be is as an operator sitting at a console to create a user account. But potentially, these are the things that have higher approval requirements, because here's where you're potentially exposing yourself to some more risk. I'll give you another example. Let's say someone's a user of a financial services platform, and they want the ability to create purchase orders. That's going to give them the authority to spend money. You might have to have an extra approval layer introduced to your fulfillment process for the intangible items to ensure the fact that this person at that particular job title is authorized to do so. Okay. One of the things that's also interesting in my lists here is if you look back on the tangible items here, I have the idea of a secure ID token. The secure ID token, those little keychain fobs that we put on we carry with us that have those rotating numbers on them that allow us to get access typically through a VPN. That would be a case where one requestable item has both a tangible component and an intangible component, because I also would need the user account to access the VPN. You might make the decision to treat those as 2 completely separate requestable items. You might try to find a way to collapse things and come up with some sort of hybrid request model that sort of bridges that gap. The bottom line with these first 2 request models, though, is that you want to create them to be as uniform as possible, and then challenge yourself, challenge your delivery capabilities, challenge your business as to why you can't use those fulfillment processes across the board. You've got abilities in tools that are based on relational databases, tools like ServiceNow, to use dynamic lookups of assignment groups and things like that. So don't allow assignment of tasks to be your barrier to that reusability. In the case of someone requesting additional request items to be added to a service catalog, if I can convince that person to use an existing request model, I probably can deploy that new request item within a matter of hours rather than within a matter of weeks. Building something up from the ground up and then doing thorough testing on it. The third request model that we want to look at are the standard change request models. And these get to be a little more difficult because we start differentiating ourselves a little bit further between the different types of standard changes that we're dealing with. We're past the standard changes where we're going to replace laptops for people and install network printers. We're now more in the territory of doing standard changes like firmware upgrades on network devices and maintenance, requesting maintenance, routine maintenance on databases, maybe log files cleared, maybe indexes created. You might have network security request model, standard changes, a request model for network security standard changes to open firewall ports, as an example. What I find works really well here is coming up with a change model that is specific to a standard operating procedure collection or a particular type of standard operating procedure. So the network team will go out and develop a list of a dozen or so standard operating procedures that would be requestable. They might be security related, they might have to do with the creation or the distribution of network drops and things like that. They can come up with a single request model that works for all network-based requests and then repeat that network-based request model for all network requests. The storage team might do the same for allocation of storage in a SAN, maybe file sharing, things like that, database team, and so on, data center maintenance. You also would consider facilities, using a single request model for facilities and providing the user who's requesting something from facilities a repeatable process to follow. When we look at the request models that we're actually creating here, we're looking at creating a consistent experience for both the person who's submitting the request and a consistent experience for those people that are actually doing the fulfillment tasks. The last one is kind of tough. The last one, the process-based request models, really, you can't really use a request model as a repeatable tool. What you need is to come up with some standard rules of engagement when you're deploying process-based requests. I like to say that you really need to focus on these process-based new hire, terminations, relocations. You need to work on these last. You need to get the work done on the tangible and the intangible items and the standard changes. When you get to these process-based requests, they are really an aggregation of multiple tangible and intangible items, all under a single request. So when all the work exists and when all the work is completed on those items, creating these types of requests becomes a lot more straightforward. More on that too when we get to the discussion strictly on new hire. I'm introducing here a process that we follow, that we tend to follow formally, informally, kind of a suggested way to think through what you want to try to achieve in your deployment of the service catalog. Really look at service catalogs. Our recommendation is to look at service catalogs deployed in a multi-phased approach. You want to be able to decide what are going to be your biggest benefit, lowest technical complexity, but highest business benefit requests that you can deploy up front that will best utilize request models. Consider that for your first phase. Consider getting all of those tangible and intangible items in place before you consider tackling new hire. The activities that we have here in our deployment or implementation process: scope, gather requirements, do detailed design, prototype, develop, and then replicate. The replicating is really taking advantage of those request models. I'll step through these one at a time. When you're scoping, I'm a big fan of the brainstorming exercise. Let's get everybody in a room that knows what we need to create service requests for. Let's get some historic data from our service desk about the types of requests that we handle and the volumes and the quantities. Let's look at some of the effort that it takes to actually complete some of those requests. Let's brainstorm a list under each of those 4 categories: tangible, intangible, standard change, and process-based. I think we'll find from organization to organization, there's probably about an 85 to 90% consistency in that brainstormed list. Then take the list of of requestable items, those requestable things, and analyze them under a few characteristics here. What is the business benefit of doing it? The technical complexity of doing it. Technical complexity, both from what it's going to take to actually configure in the tool that you're delivering, as well as the technical complexity of how it's going to impact the recipient of the tasks from that request. How difficult will it be to manage through that request process? The level of effort really is the level of effort to do the development. We try to control the level of effort by making sure that we're using or we're creating request items where request models are the most effective. We also want to consider organizational readiness. This is probably one of the biggest issues when people try to do new hire, is that there are a number of aspects of new hire that you would love to do, but the organization's just not ready to do them. Your first phase should focus on those request models. And this is why I really say do not do new hire in the first phase. It's extremely difficult to do. I know this is probably, I either just got laughs or groans from half the people out there in the audience. But you really do want to build the foundation before you tackle new hire. Now that I've mentioned it, let's go into some of these details of why I say this. All the work in configuring a requestable catalog is to get the items right. You typically have a couple of pieces that you need to have in place. The form that you're going to present to the end user that's going to ask them a series of questions and they're going to provide content. And then a workflow that executes on the back end that manages the approvals and the fulfillment tasks of that item. There's a tremendous amount of effort in figuring out how to do the first tangible requestable item. But if you use that request model approach, you can then replicate and create 10, 20, 30 other requestable items using that same collection of front-end form and followed by workflow in the back end. In the ideal situation, you're using a single workflow for all of those. You're able to dynamically determine the assignment groups that are necessary, but you're using a single fulfillment group for all of those. I'm sorry, it's a single workflow for all of those. Same thing on the intangible side. Get your user account creation understood. Once you've got those processes in place, now we can add the layer on top of who's the hiring manager, when does HR kick off this process, does IT kick off this process, or does the service desk kick off this process. The new hire is extremely complex. It will involve groups outside of IT, groups that you don't really have control over, adding complexity to what you're trying to achieve in your first phase deployment of a catalog. Okay. Essentially, when you look at what new hire is all about, it really is just a collection of those tangible and intangible items that you've already created. Somebody needs a laptop. They need a phone. They need a phone extension. They might need a mobile device. They need an account to access your ERP system. They need an Active Directory account that gives them their email address. Right? Those are all individual items that should be requestable on their own. Figuring out what all of those need to be first, and then putting the new hire umbrella over it, using a mechanism to allow you to capture all of those requests together is the recommended approach. Avoid the temptation of the new hire checklist. Okay, this is the idea of just basically presenting a generic form to someone with a bunch of checkboxes on it. Give them this, give them that, check, check, check. You can do this approach. Solutions will support this approach. However, the biggest issue is that they don't necessarily scale. The new hire checklist, the single one requestable form with checkboxes that then kicks off workflow in the back end that does nothing but fire off a whole bunch of notifications to people, doesn't truly scale that well. It also doesn't give you an understanding of the amount of work effort it takes to fulfill these tasks. Another problem is once you do get the tangible and intangible items in place and it's time to migrate to a more advanced new hire solution, the whole checklist solution is a throwaway. Plus the data that it was created under that solution is incompatible with the data that you're going to be creating from that point on. So you're not even going to be able to report back through those time windows. It's worth the effort up front. Another tempting approach is to use the doppelganger method, where you're going to basically say, make the new guy look just like me. This can be effective. I'm not saying this is not a technique that I've used in the past, but what's difficult about this is, are you basically telling someone then, make someone look like me, forcing them to go do the detective work to figure out what you look like? It might be easier for the requester to say, make someone look like me, but it's making it more difficult for the fulfillment person, who then has to go identify everything. If they don't have access to what that person, what the doppelganger already has, they don't know what to make the new person look like. A couple of the key questions you need to really answer for yourselves. Where does the process start? Some organizations have the process of new hire start in HR once the person's hired. Some people, HR might be the last group to know. You know, some organizations work it one direction and some organizations work it in another. Some cases, the hiring manager has the ability to hire who they need. In some cases, the process is initiated at the service desk. So wherever your situation is here, you want to understand where that process begins. Where's the first time someone has an opportunity to write down that person's name and figure out where that process begins? Then start to think about, what tangible and intangible items is this person going to need? What data must I have in order to determine that? Once you created this, when you do create this request, who's actually the requester? One of the difficulties that some people have, that I've had to deal with in the past, is that people have wanted the request for a new hire to actually be for the new hire. Well, if the new hire doesn't exist yet, we don't have any evidence of this person in our directory services, we don't have a user account for this person in our ITSM solution, how do we create a request for them? Do we create it for the requesting manager? Okay. Bottom question there, what do we know about the new hire and when do we know it? We need to determine this before we can really come up with the best approach for solving this particular problem. Next, we're going to move on to gathering requirements. We've done the scoping. We've determined what we're going to include in scope. We're going to identify what needs to be gathered from a requirements perspective. We actually complete a request item requirements document, and if you're working with some folks from Fruition on an implementation, you're going to be seeing these request item requirements documents as kind of a template that allow you to capture the information about financial approvals, additional approvals, and fulfillment tasks. Okay. Each of your request models should have a fairly standard templated version of what that request requirements document looks like. You will need to make some tailoring. When I say request models, I'm not saying that you must keep everything exactly the same. I think obviously some of the configuration characteristics of a request might be different. The questions you might ask someone about a desktop versus a laptop could very easily be different. You'd want to gather those individual requirements here. Once you've completed that document, you're going to have information about how the actual fulfillment process is going to be controlled, what questions are going to be asked, the types of questions you're going to be asking the end user when they actually fulfill it, or when they create the request in the first place, and then what fulfillment and approval tasks are going to be necessary. You might have some unique additional data requirements. One example might be you have a financial services platform that has a long list of potential roles that someone could have within the financial services platform that allows them to do accounts payable versus accounts receivable versus purchasing. Some of the additional data that might be required is an approval matrix. You might have to actually have an approval matrix that says this particular job role approves accounts receivable, another job role approves accounts payable, etc. You'd want to capture that additional data requirement in the requirements document as well. Next, prototype your request models. Build out those request models and begin to show how they can actually create some consistency for the items that you're delivering. When you're going to do replication, some of the nice features of ServiceNow is that it does include a request item copy button. It creates a complete copy of a request item, allowing you then to just take from the tangible request item template, copy it, provide it the name that it needs for the particular item you're going to deploy, make whatever tweaks you need to make, get ready for deployment. You also can copy that workflow if necessary. The ideal situation, I think, is that you reuse the workflow that you already have in place, that you write that workflow, you create that workflow to do the dynamic assignments, the dynamic short descriptions on your fulfillment tasks, all based on the items that are actually being requested. Okay. Once you've built out those request models, you now can present yourself to the rest of the process owners for these fulfillment tasks, these fulfillment items, and say, my time to deliver based on my request models might be down to a couple of hours, provided that your requirements don't step too far outside of my request model. If someone's asking for something that's completely outside the request model structure, it might take you actually several days to get it through a full evaluation and deployment process. You're going to then develop your request items and you're going to replicate. You're going to replicate as much as you possibly can using those copy techniques, copying your requests from one to the next. You're also going to be potentially then copying the workflows that are behind the scenes. Some implementation best practices. Keep it simple at first. Start with items that everybody understands. It's great to sort of, pick things that are visible. Things that can draw people's attention. Okay. Develop that foundation before tackling new hire. Focus on reusability. All the work is in the items. Remember that all the work is in the items. The total number of some of the metrics you want to consider. Total number of service requests based on just general volume. We want to understand how many service requests you have going through your system. Breakdown of requests by each stage. The nice thing about using workflow engines is they can provide you a progression stage through the workflow. You want to look at what's been backlogged. Potentially you might have some things on back order. Average time to completion. One of the things to consider when I think of average time to completion, and I even consider things relative to backlog here, is I'm going to want to be tracking SLAs and OLAs. I always consider the delivery of a requested item, the completion of a service request, both, to be under the control of a service level agreement. It's the agreement that manages the relationship between IT service provider and the customer. Now, when it actually comes time to execute individual fulfillment tasks like procurement, configuration, shipping, those I would put under the control of an operational level agreement. Each of those individual tasks required for fulfillment of a request item should each have their own OLA that would add up and fit within the expected duration of the SLA for the item, so that you can ensure the fact that you're actually achieving the objectives as far as a delivery time perspective. You want to understand costs associated to individual completion of tasks, and also be able to do some sort of client satisfaction surveys, customer satisfaction survey. Okay. Some of the risks. Risks you're going to expose yourself to: poorly defined scope. It's extremely easy, and request models don't make it any harder for you, but it's extremely easy to become victim to scope creep. You really want to have an agreed upon scope and lock it down and stick to it. Service Catalog can provide you a slippery slope where it just becomes, tempting to throw one more item into the list. Okay. A lot of organizations have unclear objectives about their fulfillment processes, about what they're trying to achieve. I like to say that the consistency of the request model, or the creation of consistency through use of the request model, can help clarify objectives of fulfillment processes. Okay? This can be a very complex tool without foundation. It can be very complex, and as much as we'd like to say that we go to the business or to the actual stakeholders in these processes and allow them to tell us what they need. We need to do that, but we also need to try to encourage them that reduced complexity, reduced total cost of ownership are some things that they can take as an advantage, and request models will help them do that. You don't really want to open the door and let people design tremendously complex processes. Okay? Badly designed back-end fulfillment processes can be one of the issues. A lot of cases, I've worked with some organizations where they said, just send me a single generic task and I'll go do all the work. Right? I just need one task and I'll get all the work done behind that. That's fine. You can do that. However, it doesn't give you any indication that how long it takes to actually procure something, how long it takes to configure it, how long it takes to get it packaged and shipped or through QA or finally installed. You're losing out on some of those individual stage metrics when you have poorly defined back-end fulfillment processes. And then also inadequate monitoring capabilities. You want to be able to always see the progression of your processes, of your fulfillment processes through their life cycle and be able to report on all of that. I actually made it through my content a little bit faster than I thought, so we have a little extra time for questions. I do see that there are 2 questions in the list already, and we'll open up the call here in a second and let anyone just raise their hand for a question. So if your hand is raised now and you don't have a question, you might want to lower your hand, but raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. I'll address these 2 that are in the question queue already. Someone asked, will these slides be available after the webinar? The webinar itself will be made available electronically, so you can play through the webinar. The slide content is part of our training course, so we won't make the slides directly available outside the training course, but certainly this recorded webinar will be available within, I believe, 2 weeks. Next question. What is the advantage of having a financial approver see the request before the manager approval? I think the financial approvals in most organizations are at higher level than those at the manager approval level. I think I would ask the question, and if you want to jump in on this, please feel free. I think I would ask the question and say, what is the purpose of the manager approval if it's not potentially a financial approval altogether? I think that I would consider the manager approval to really be another financial approval, even though it might not specifically be a budget accountability. I would include the manager's approval as part of any hierarchical framework of approvals that I would have. Like, let's say there's a manager, a direct line manager would have to approve. Then it might go to a department head or maybe someone who's responsible for a cost center that's going to pay for the particular request. And then lastly go to a VP. That's perfectly acceptable. I think what you'd want to understand is the financial approval end-to-end procedure for us includes a manager's approval up front. Okay? Another question. What is the advantage of using workflows over execution plans? This is, I think, a specific ServiceNow question. It's a great question. The workflow is a far more advanced. You have much more control over your fulfillment process. It's the newer technology. The execution plan capability still works, still supported, still part of the tool, but I find that I can do more. I have more control over what I want to try to achieve with a workflow. One of the things that I'll do in a workflow, and actually one of the things we have people do as part of our Service Catalog Workshop class, is we'll show you how to create workflows using little bits of JavaScript in the activities so that the activity names are representative of both the activity that needs to take place, like procurement, the item that needs to be procured, and who you're procuring it for. You just get a little more control over the output when you use workflows. Also, in a lot of cases, for customers that are considering runbook automation, runbook automation is an excellent way to close the loop on some of those intangible fulfillments. You can write runbook automation to actually do the fulfillment activity for you. Once something's approved, you automate that. And that would require using workflow as the mechanism for doing so. Chime in again if you'd like more of an answer on that. Another question. Thank you for this. Oh, I appreciate that. It clarified the relationship for me between the request fulfillment, and the overreaching process, and an overreaching process, and the service catalog. I've been skipping the request module in ServiceNow, not knowing how to fit it in. Yeah, see, this is easily one of the things that can trip people up, is that you might consider overloading the incident management capability to try to provide you request fulfillment capability. And what you end up doing, I like to refer to it kind of as the space shuttle approach, right? We built the space shuttle so that it could do 5 jobs sort of well instead of doing 1 job really, really well, right? So we kind of think of this in terms of incident management should focus on incident management only, which is restore normal service as quickly as possible. Request fulfillment, completely separate, should be separate data that allows us to respond to requests from users. Okay. Next question. How can we use the business services in the CMDB to drive the service catalog? This is another great question. One of the things that I've actually done in the past from a configuration perspective is I've taken service request items and I've created a relationship to the business service table in the CMDB so that I've associated a particular business service to maybe a series of requestable items. And you're basically all you're doing is going to take the request item record, the request item that's going to go into your catalog, and add a relationship on that record back to CMDB CI service. Then someone, when they create a new request, you can put that service, identify it on the item itself. That gives you the ability, when you're now creating your request model and you're going to put together your workflow, you can dot walk your way from the requested item all the way to the business service and get access to information like the business service owner, the business service approval group, things like that. It's an outstanding way to get to some consistent data that you then can put in dynamic lookups in your workflow and rely on your business service catalog to provide you those approvals. Okay? It actually works really well. Next question. Do request items work well for the user system change module also? This is one of the things that there's 2 separate techniques for putting something into the service catalog to make something requestable. You're going to use 2 separate pieces of ServiceNow's technology to do this. The requested item is really focused on the actual item that gets created under a service request versus using a record producer to create a change request. Okay. I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly now that I read it again. If you could, maybe, actually that was Karen, if you could elaborate on that maybe in one other question, that would be great. I don't know if I'm answering it correctly. I think what I thought you were asking was the separation of how I'm going to deliver requestable items versus how I'm going to deliver standard changes. I would use record producers to deliver my standard changes through the catalog, and I would use requestable items to deliver my service catalog options through the service request options through the catalog. Okay. Got a bunch of questions now. Let me, all right, one from Nicole. I understand the desire to reuse the workflow, but I can see many reasons to copy. specifically in ServiceNow if the time for each task delivers requiring the delivery time for one item to be 5 days and another item to be 10. You have no choice. You potentially do have a choice. We've configured this one as well. You can actually have, I've extended and actually maintained fulfillment task durations as part of my request item definition. Now, I'm not saying that at all costs reuse your workflow, don't copy your workflow. That's entirely up to your discretion as to how well you want to manage. I love working with the workflow capabilities, the workflow editor. I think it's a great tool. I think it's easy to manage multiple workflows. But I think that what you will find is that there are ways to dynamically build a workflow that will dynamically go look up certain durations for tasks actually stored at the request item level. Also, there's another half to this question. Task state fulfillment get. I understand that you can have this task state fulfillment get item short description name, so your task description would be clear, but the detailed description with step 1, 2, and 3 to do this step 1, 2, and 3 shouldn't be, unless you copied it from the workflow. Yeah, again, this is another area where you can, if you wanted to try to manage a lot of the content in those tasks, you could have mechanisms to allow you to look things up based on the item that's defined. So you might create, you could actually create a template. You could use a template fulfillment for the configuration tasks for all your items, create unique templates for each, and when you actually create that task, use that template. You're making some good points though too. I don't disagree with the fact that copying a workflow and making some unique changes to it to fit to an item is a necessary activity. I completely agree with that. I just think that where possible, you want to try to find opportunities to reduce the number of those that you need to manage. Got another question. We're not ready for self-service yet. Does it make sense to deploy a catalog? Yeah, I do think it makes sense to deploy a catalog. I think that there's opportunities to use record producers to help your IT organization utilize other aspects of ServiceNow in kind of a quick style format. Logging incidents. Maybe you've got people that aren't working at the service desk, but they constantly get annoyed by the flyby person that stands over their cube wall and asks them to solve a problem for them. They want to be able to forward that information onto the service desk. You could create a record producer, deploy it in your service catalog, make it very easy for someone to just quickly log the fact that they ended up handling an incident for somebody, and you've now provided another piece of data for your metrics. Also, self-service, if the concept of self-service really only applies to employees, if that's really the context of your question here, I think you want to consider internal IT folks can still utilize the catalog for requesting things. So I do think that there's a place for it. A couple more. Okay, thank you, Karen. Got it. Yes. What do you suggest for a request portal to be more appealing in its design and intuitive from an end user standpoint? I think that we've done a few examples of the configuration management system and the CMS in ServiceNow to simplify the user's experience. Like we've done, almost like a Sesame Street version where you've got 3 big buttons on the screen, and one of them says something's broken, the next one says I need something, and the third one says search the knowledge base, right? You presenting something that is appealing to the end user is always kind of a constant struggle for IT. It's been a struggle, to be honest with you. It's been a struggle with IT service management platforms too. I think that ServiceNow does a nice job of making a manageable tool presentable. But I think the configuration management system is probably the place you'd want to go if you actually want to make it more appealing for people to see. You get control over style sheets, you get control over graphics, you can structure, you have so much more control over the structure. And I think that's the last question. Are there any, are there some hands up that people that want to ask some questions? I might ask Christina to help me know how to do this. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.